The lantern light barely reached the edge of the porch when Jacob Thornton saw her collapse against his fence. Blood stained the wooden rails where her hand had grabbed for support. She wasn't supposed to be there. No Apache had come this close to his ranch in 3 years, not since the treaty pushed the tribes further into the mountains. But there she was, barely breathing, one hand pressed against a wound in her side that painted her doe-skin dress a darker shade of brown. Jacob stood frozen, rifle already in his hands from the moment he'd heard the stumbling footsteps. The woman's eyes met his, not pleading, not afraid, just holding his gaze with the kind of strength that comes from accepting whatever fate brings. She was young, maybe 20 summers, with long black hair matted with sweat and dust from what must have been miles of running. Her breathing came shallow and quick. He should have turned away. Every neighbor within 50 miles would say the same thing. Let the desert take what the desert claims. But Jacob had buried a wife and daughter to fever 2 winters back, and something about seeing another soul slip away on his land felt like a choice he couldn't unmake. He lowered the rifle. The woman's eyes flickered with surprise as he approached, setting the weapon against the porch rail. He held up both hands, empty, then gestured toward the house. She didn't move at first, studying him with the wariness of a wounded animal that knows kindness can be a trap. Then her legs buckled, and Jacob caught her before she hit the ground. If you're hearing this story and wondering what happened next, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss how this night changed everything. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love knowing where my listeners are from around the world. Now, let's get back to Jacob and the decision that would test everything he believed about right and wrong. Inside the house, Jacob laid her on the old wooden table his grandfather had built, the same table where he'd eaten 1,000 meals alone since Sarah and Emma died. The Apache woman's wound wasn't as deep as he'd feared. A bullet had grazed her ribs, tearing flesh, but missing anything vital. He cleaned it with whiskey that made her jaw clench, but drew no sound from her lips, then wrapped it with strips torn from one of Sarah's old dresses. When he brought her water, she drank like someone who'd been running for days. He heated beans and cornbread, the only meal he knew how to make anymore, and watched as she ate with controlled urgency, never taking her eyes off him for more than a second. She hadn't spoken a word, and Jacob wondered if she even knew English. "Jacob," he said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to her with a questioning look. She swallowed her food, considered him for a long moment, then spoke in surprisingly clear English. "Nasha." Her voice was rough from thirst and exertion. "It means owl. You speak English. Mission school before." She didn't elaborate on what came before or after, but the bitterness in her voice suggested the education hadn't been voluntary. "Who's hunting you?" Nasha's hand moved instinctively to her wound. "Soldiers. 3 days ago, they came to our camp. Said we violated treaty boundaries by hunting elk in the canyon. We've hunted there for generations. The treaty never forbade it." She paused, pain crossing her face. "They killed my brother when he tried to explain. Killed others. I ran." Jacob had heard rumors in town about increased military presence in the territories, about new interpretations of old agreements. He'd dismissed them as the kind of talk that fills saloons when men have nothing better to do than complain. Looking at Nasha now, he realized some rumors carry the weight of truth. "They'll come here," he said quietly. "Yes." She met his eyes again, and this time he saw something else there. Not just strength, but a question. Why would a white farmer risk everything for an Apache woman he'd never met? Jacob didn't have an answer he could put into words. Maybe it was the 2 graves under the oak tree behind the house. Maybe it was the way his world had shrunk to just him and the land and the terrible silence of loss. Maybe he was just tired of choosing the safe thing, the expected thing, when it meant letting someone die within sight of his home. "Then they'll come," he said, "but you're not leaving till you can walk without bleeding." Nasha studied him for a long time, then gave a slight nod. In that gesture, Jacob saw the beginning of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense that what he did mattered beyond just surviving another day. She slept on the table, exhausted beyond the point where pride or caution mattered. Jacob sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the glass. He didn't expect the soldiers to track her at night, but he'd learned long ago that expecting nothing was how you survived when the world turned hostile. Dawn came cold and pink across the high desert. Jacob had dozed in his chair, jerking awake every hour to check the windows. Nasha still slept, her breathing deeper and more regular than the night before. The wound had stopped bleeding, and some color had returned to her face. He was making coffee when he saw the first warrior. The Apache sat motionless on a paint horse at the edge of the tree line, maybe 300 yards out. He wasn't hiding. He wanted to be seen. As Jacob watched, more riders emerged from the trees, spreading out in a wide arc that curved around the front of his property. Then more appeared from the rocky outcrop to the south, and more from the wash to the north. They kept coming until the ranch was surrounded by a sea of mounted warriors, their horses still as statues, the riders watching the house with an intensity that made Jacob's hands shake as he poured his coffee. He counted quickly, then counted again, certain he'd made a mistake. But the number didn't change. Nearly 200 Apache warriors, armed with rifles and bows, formed a silent circle around his land. The morning sun glinted off gun barrels and arrowheads. Not one of them moved or spoke. "They came for me." Nasha's voice made him turn. She'd risen from the table, moving slowly, but standing on her own. She looked out the window at the gathered warriors, and something complicated passed across her face. Relief, fear, resignation, pride, all tangled together. "Who are they?" Jacob asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "My people, my clan. My father leads them." She pointed to a rider at the center of the line, an older man with grey streaks in his long hair, sitting a black horse with the bearing of someone who'd commanded respect his entire life. "He is Goyakla. The whites call him by other names." Jacob felt his stomach drop. He knew enough Apache to recognize that name, knew enough history to understand he was looking at one of the most formidable war leaders in the territory. This wasn't a raiding party or a hunting group. This was a fighting force that could overrun his ranch in minutes, that could paint his land red before the sun cleared the mountains. "What happens now?" he asked. Nasha limped to the door, her hand on the frame for support. "Now I go out. I tell them you gave me shelter, gave me food, tended my wounds. I tell them you treated me with honor when you could have left me to die, or turned me over to the soldiers." "And then?" She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw something like a smile touch the corners of her mouth. "Then we see if my father believes that a white farmer can have honor, or if he believes that kindness from your people is just another kind of trap." Jacob felt the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment. He could have stayed inside when he heard the footsteps, could have fired a warning shot, could have ridden to town and brought back the territorial marshal. Any of those choices would have been easier, safer, more acceptable to the world he lived in. But he'd made a different choice, and now nearly 200 Apache warriors waited for what would happen next. "I'll go with you," he said. "That would be foolish. You would die. Maybe, but I'm the one who chose to help you. Seems right I should be the one to explain why." Nasha studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. Then she nodded slowly. "You are a strange man, Jacob Thornton. You do not think like the others. Lost too much to care what the others think anymore." They walked out together, Nasha leaning slightly on his arm, Jacob's rifle left inside the house in a gesture he hoped would be understood. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pinewood. The circle of warriors remained perfectly still as they approached, 200 pairs of eyes watching every step. Goyakla nudged his horse forward, separating from the line. He rode slowly toward them, stopping 20 feet away. His face was weathered and hard, carved by decades of war and loss, and the endless struggle to keep his people alive in a world that wanted them erased. He looked at his daughter first, taking in the bandage visible through her torn dress, the way she favored her left side, the exhaustion still evident in her posture. Then he looked at Jacob, and in that gaze, Jacob felt himself measured against some standard he couldn't fully comprehend. He met the war leader's eyes and held them, not in challenge, but in the simple acknowledgement of one man looking at another across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Nasha spoke in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Jacob didn't understand the words, but he heard his name spoken, heard the rhythm of explanation, heard something in her tone that sounded like testimony offered in his defense. When she finished, silence settled over the ranch like snow. Goyakla sat motionless on his horse, his expression unreadable. Jacob wondered if this was how it would end, standing in his own yard, morning coffee getting cold on his kitchen table, facing death delivered by 200 warriors because he'd chosen mercy over fear. Then Goyakla spoke, his English heavily accented but clear. The soldiers say we are animals, say we have no honor, no law, no understanding of right action. They burn our camps and call it peace. They kill our hunters and call it justice. He paused, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. But you are not like them. I'm just a farmer, Jacob said quietly. I saw someone hurt and dying, couldn't walk away from that. Many could, many have. Many would celebrate finding one of us bleeding, would hasten our death, and consider it a good day's work. Goyakla gestured to his daughter. You did not know she was the daughter of Goyakla, did not know that helping her might bring you honor or protection. You knew only that she was Apache, that helping her would make you an enemy to your own people, yet you helped her anyway. Jacob had no answer to that. It was simply true. Goyakla turned his horse slightly, addressing the gathered warriors in Apache. His voice rose and fell with the cadence of formal speech, carrying across the desert morning. When he finished, a ripple moved through the assembled riders, not quite agreement, but acknowledgement. The war leader looked back at Jacob. There is a debt, my daughter's life for your mercy. This debt must be honored. He raised his hand, and 3 warriors rode forward, leading horses loaded with deer carcasses, bundles of tanned hides, and woven baskets filled with dried berries and herbs. We give you food and goods. We give you something more valuable, our word that no harm will come to you or your land from our hands. You will be known among my people as the one who chose mercy. That name will protect you. Jacob looked at the gifts being unloaded near his porch, understanding that refusing them would be an insult worse than any he could imagine. I don't need payment for doing what's right. This is not payment. This is honor answering honor. You may not need it, but we need to give it. That is our way. Goyakla's expression softened almost imperceptibly. There are few enough bridges between our peoples. You have built one with your choice. We acknowledge it. Nasha stepped forward, away from Jacob's supporting arm, standing straighter despite the pain it clearly caused her. She spoke to her father in Apache, and he nodded. Then she turned to Jacob, and he saw tears standing in her eyes, though they didn't fall. I told him you lost your family, that your house carries the silence of grief, that perhaps that is why you understood what it means to watch someone die, when you have the power to prevent it." She paused, searching for words. "He says that grief can make a man bitter, or it can make him wise. You chose wisdom." Two warriors dismounted and came to stand on either side of Nasha, ready to support her for the ride back to wherever the clan was camped. She looked at Jacob one last time, and in that look was everything they couldn't say: gratitude and sorrow, the acknowledgement of a moment that would ripple through both their lives, the strange, sad truth that they would likely never meet again despite this bond forged in blood and mercy. "May your God watch over you, Jacob Thornton," she said quietly, "as mine will watch over you now." Then she was mounted, seated behind one of the warriors, and the great circle of Apache riders was turning, flowing back toward the mountains like water returning to its source. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only hoofprints in the dust, and the gifts stacked on Jacob's porch as proof they'd been there at all. Jacob stood alone in his yard, watching the last riders disappear into the tree line. The sun had fully cleared the mountains now, warming the air, burning off the morning chill. He felt something shift inside him, some weight he hadn't known he was carrying finally settling into a different position. He'd spent 2 years choosing survival over connection, safety over risk, the known sorrow of solitude over the unknown dangers of caring about anything beyond his fence line. In one night, that had changed. He'd made a choice that defied every practical consideration, every survival instinct, every piece of advice the world would have given him. And he'd discovered something he thought he'd buried with Sarah and Emma, that he was still capable of caring whether another human being lived or died, still capable of risking everything for a stranger, still capable of believing that some things mattered more than just staying alive another day. The gifts Goyakla's warriors had left would keep him fed through the coming winter. The promise of protection would shield him from the raids that periodically swept through the territory. But the real gift was smaller and harder to name, the knowledge that mercy was still possible in a hard land, that honor could still be answered with honor, that the divide between peoples wasn't always as absolute as the world insisted it must be. 3 days later, a patrol of cavalry soldiers rode up to his ranch, led by a lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave. They were tracking an Apache woman, wounded, who'd escaped a military action. Had Jacob seen anything suspicious? Jacob looked at the young officer, at the dozen armed men behind him, at the certainty in their eyes that what they were doing was right and necessary and just. He thought about Nasha's brother, killed for hunting elk in a canyon his people had used for generations. He thought about Goyakla's words, that the soldiers called them animals, denied them honor, burned their camps, and called it peace. "Haven't seen any Apache," Jacob said calmly. "Been quiet out here." The lieutenant looked around the ranch, his eyes lingering on the deer meat hanging in Jacob's smokehouse, the fresh hides stretched on frames, the baskets of provisions on his porch. "You seem well supplied for a man living alone." "Good hunting season," Jacob replied. The officer studied him for a long moment, suspicion clear in his expression. But he had no proof, no evidence, nothing but an old farmer's word against the vast emptiness of the high desert. Finally, he nodded. "You see any Apache, you report it immediately. That's not a request." "Understood." The patrol rode out, and Jacob watched them go with the same stillness he'd learned from watching Goyakla's warriors. When they were gone, he went back inside his house, back to the table where Nasha had slept, back to the life that looked the same from outside, but felt fundamentally different from within. He'd chosen mercy, and mercy had chosen him back. In a land where most stories ended in blood and loss, he'd found one that ended in honor and hope. It wasn't redemption. He didn't need redemption. It wasn't salvation. He wasn't looking for salvation. It was simply proof that even in the hardest country, between the most divided peoples, in the darkest times, a single act of human kindness could still matter. The Apache kept their word. No raids touched Jacob's land. The cattle he bought the following spring grazed unmolested. The crops he planted grew without incident, and sometimes in the evening, when the sun painted the mountains purple and gold, he would see a rider on the distant ridgeline, a watcher, a guardian, a reminder of the debt that honor had created. Jacob never saw Nasha again, but he thought of her often, wondered if she'd healed fully, if she'd found peace among her people, if she ever told the story of the farmer who'd chosen mercy when mercy made no sense. He hoped she had, hoped the story lived on, hoped somewhere in the divide between their worlds, their shared moment of humanity still resonated. He'd fed an Apache woman when every instinct told him to turn away. By morning, 200 warriors had surrounded his ranch. And in choosing mercy over fear, in choosing compassion over hatred, in choosing to see a human being instead of an enemy, Jacob Thornton had discovered something worth more than safety, more than acceptance, more than the hollow comfort of doing what others expected. He'd discovered that he was still alive, still capable of honor, still able to build bridges even when the world insisted on walls. And in the hard country of the high desert, where the sun bleached bones white and the wind carried the ghosts of all the violence that had come before, that small truth shone like a lantern in the darkness, a reminder that mercy, once given freely, could echo through the years, long after the moment had passed. The ranch stood quiet under the stars that night, as it had for years, as it would for years to come. But something had changed, something subtle and profound. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of a choice made, a life saved, a debt honored, and the strange enduring power of human kindness in the face of a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Jacob Thornton had fed an Apache woman, and in doing so he'd fed his own soul back to life.